In the vast reaches of the galaxy, where stars blinked like scattered diamonds across an endless ocean of dark space, there lived a girl, a DeathWorlder. A being born on a planet where survival was a daily struggle, where the landscape was harsh, and only the most ruthless of creatures could live long enough to learn the meaning of survival. The world she came from was known as Srikta, a planet torn by storms that could flatten entire cities, ravaged by the hunger of beasts whose claws could shred metal, and haunted by endless nights where the air itself seemed to conspire against life. It was a place where you could walk for hours, lost in the dense, humid forests of trees that could swallow a person whole, where the sky was always clouded, and the ground constantly shook as though the world itself was alive with rage. She had always believed she was the only one of her kind, the only DeathWorlder in existence. In her mind, the brutal conditions of her homeworld were not just an accident of nature. They were the result of a cosmic mistake, a quirk of fate that had placed a fragile species on a planet that no one could ever truly understand. She often found herself gazing out into the stars, wondering if there were others like her, beings who lived in the same shadow of constant struggle and survival, but she had never found an answer. The galaxy was vast, and the planets beyond her own seemed as unreachable as dreams. Her name was Elora, and her people had been born to endure. Her skin shimmered with the hue of the deep forest green, her eyes an electric blue like the storm-filled skies of Srikta, her body lithe and quick, built for surviving in the brutal environments of her home. She had learned to navigate the deadly swamps, to outwit the apex predators, and to remain hidden from the ever-watchful eyes of the Srikta behemoths. From a young age, Elora had been taught that she was alone. There were no allies, no friends, only the necessity of strength and the instinct to survive. One fateful day, as she wandered the thick forests near the northern pole of Srikta, a ship appeared in the sky, cutting through the dense clouds with ease. The sleek, metallic vessel was unlike anything Elora had ever seen. It was not a storm-shattered remnant of an old war, nor a beast of metal designed for war. It gleamed in the harsh light of the storm clouds above, as if it had been made of something beyond her understanding. She stared in awe, her heart racing. Ships never came to Srikta. The storms, the beasts, the very nature of the planet kept anyone from trying to land here. It was a forbidden world, a place that even the most daring explorers avoided. The ship crashed. It didn't burn, it didn't explode in a flurry of fire and ash. Instead, it slammed into the earth with a thunderous impact, sending a shockwave that shook the ground beneath Elora's feet. She instinctively ducked behind a nearby tree, her senses heightened, as her instincts screamed at her to stay hidden. For a moment, everything was silent, the forest around her holding its breath. Then, the quiet was shattered by the sound of mechanical whirring as the ship's doors slowly opened. Out stepped a figure, human. Elora had seen humans before, or at least their likenesses. Holoscreens and data records had shown her images of them, but they were always distant, far-off creatures, always pictured on worlds that were nothing like her own. She had heard stories of them, too, creatures of great intelligence, adaptable and resourceful. But this was real. The human's appearance was unlike the one she had imagined. His clothing was tattered from the crash, but there was a certain ruggedness to him that Elora couldn't help but admire. His hair was dark, messy from the journey, and his face was hardened by the look of someone who had lived through more than their fair share of battles. But his eyes, those eyes, were filled with something Elora could not name. Curiosity? Wonder? Fear? He looked around, scanning his surroundings with confusion, as though he were uncertain of where he was, of how he had ended up on this forsaken world. For a moment, she did nothing. She simply observed him from the shadows, her mind racing. What was he doing here? Why had he come to a place that no sane being would dare approach? Was he a scout for an invading force? A lost wanderer from another dimension? She couldn't be sure. The human stumbled forward, his steps uncertain, as he called out in a voice that echoed against the distant mountains. "Hello?" His voice was rough, but there was a note of desperation in it, as if he had been lost for days or weeks. He repeated his call, but no answer came. Ellora's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should turn and run. She knew that a human had no place here, and that if he stayed, he would surely perish in the unforgiving wilds of Srikta. But something stopped her. A strange pull, a curiosity that mirrored his own, made her stay hidden and watch. She had never met a human before, never spoken to one. And yet, here he was, standing on her world, lost and alone, much like she had been her whole life. Something inside her shifted, a feeling that was foreign, even to her. Was this the moment? The one she had been waiting for? The chance to understand the universe beyond the storm clouds, the predators, the isolation? Or was this just another cruel trick of fate? Another being who would vanish as quickly as he had arrived, leaving her to return to her solitary existence? The human seemed to sense he was not alone. His eyes darted around, and for a brief second, Ellora caught his gaze. She froze. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two beings from different worlds, connected by nothing more than their shared sense of isolation and survival. He didn't know she was there. She didn't know what to say. Finally, Ellora's instincts took over. She stepped forward, emerging from her hiding place, her steps light and silent. The human seemed to stiffen at the sound of her approach, but when he saw her, his confusion turned to wonder. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, and his eyes widened in shock as he took in her appearance. The smooth, green skin, the eyes that glowed like lightning, and the strange aura of power she exuded, as if she were one with the world around her. Ellora had never spoken to a human before. She didn't know the words to say. Instead, she simply nodded toward him, silently acknowledging his presence. Her mind was swirling with 1,000 questions, but the only one that seemed to rise above the others was, "What now?" The human took a step closer. "Are you real? Am I dreaming? I didn't think I was going to survive this crash. But you're not, like anything I've seen." Ellora's mind raced. This human, this strange being from beyond the storm-filled skies, had come to her world. He was lost, just like her, though perhaps in a different way. He had no place here, just as she had never truly had a place among the stars. But in that moment, as they stood face to face, she realized something. Perhaps she was not alone. Perhaps the universe, with all its stars and galaxies, had a strange way of bringing the most unlikely of beings together. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't the only one who had wandered into the unknown. And perhaps, together, they could find a way to survive. Not just on Srikta, but in the vast, endless expanse of the universe. Ellora stood in front of the human, her gaze unwavering, as she observed him more closely. His expression was a mixture of confusion and awe, as if he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were telling him. He took a cautious step forward, still unsure of the nature of the creature before him. She had seen beings like him before, of course, distant images of humans recorded by explorers in the distant reaches of space. But never in her wildest imagination had she expected to meet one in person, let alone on her own DeathWorld. She couldn't help but wonder if there was something fatefully peculiar about this moment. What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, still processing the impossible sight of her. She considered his question for a moment, the words she wanted to say frozen on her tongue. "What am I?" Her mind flashed back to her childhood, to the stories told by the elders of Srikta, the legends of a race born to endure, whose survival was forged in the fires of a harsh world. But those stories didn't matter now. She wasn't here to answer ancient riddles. She was here, in this moment, with this stranger who had crashed onto her world, A world no one could survive without paying the ultimate price. I am Elora. She finally spoke, her voice low but clear. The words felt strange on her tongue. She rarely spoke to anyone, let alone a stranger. But the human's eyes, wide and full of something she couldn't name, made her feel like perhaps words were the only way forward. Elora, he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound. I'm Jake, he stammered, his gaze never leaving her face. He took another step toward her, his movements slow, as if he feared spooking her. Elora's senses flared, alert to the shift in his demeanor. He didn't seem aggressive. In fact, despite his confusion and wariness, there was something oddly disarming about him. Perhaps it was his vulnerability, the way he looked at her, not as a threat, but as someone who might understand. Elora's own instincts told her that his arrival wasn't an accident. Fate had sent him here, just as it had sent her to survive on this cursed planet. Jake, she murmured, testing the name. It felt foreign to her, just as his presence did. What brings you here, human? He seemed taken aback by her question, but his expression shifted to one of uncertainty. I was on a mission, he said, struggling to gather his thoughts. I was on a ship, part of a research team. We were studying uncharted territories. But something went wrong. A storm, and we were hit. The ship, it crashed, and I don't know where the others are. Elora's brow furrowed. A research mission? She had no understanding of what a research mission meant, but the way he spoke, the tension in his voice, suggested that he wasn't lying. His world was one of curiosity, of discovery, world so different from her own. On Srikta, survival wasn't about exploration. It was about staying alive long enough to see another day. You don't know what this place is, Elora said, her voice now harder, more serious. The thought of him wandering freely across Srikta was enough to send a chill down her spine. No one, not even the most experienced explorers, had ever survived the wilds of this planet without paying a price. No, I don't, Jake admitted, looking around nervously, as if the trees themselves might rise up against him. I had no idea. It's nothing like what we thought it would be. My data, our data, had nothing on this. Elora gave him a cold, unwavering look. There's nothing here that can help you. You should turn back. Go back to your ship, find shelter. Jake's face tightened with a mixture of frustration and confusion. I can't. My ship's destroyed. I'm alone out here. For a moment, Elora considered leaving him to fend for himself. It was the way of her people. No one was ever there for you, not unless they were forced to be. Trust was a luxury only the dead could afford. But as she stood there, she felt something strange twist within her, a reluctant understanding. This human was no different than her in that respect. He was stranded, vulnerable, and just as alone as she had been. But she couldn't let her guard down. She couldn't be too soft, not in this world. There were no second chances on Srikta. Follow me, Elora said, surprising herself with the calmness in her tone. I'll show you a place where you can stay for the night. Jake blinked in surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to offer any help. You'll help me? He asked, his voice filled with an undercurrent of disbelief. I'll show you where you can survive for now, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. But know this. Tomorrow you leave. This world is not kind to outsiders. Without waiting for his response, Elora turned and began walking, her footsteps silent against the damp earth. She could hear Jake scrambling to catch up behind her. She didn't turn around, but she could sense his presence lingering near, his hesitation to trust her still weighing heavily on his mind. As they walked through the dense forest, Elora led him deeper into the wilds. Her senses were sharpened, every noise, every subtle change in the atmosphere sending signals to her mind. She knew these woods, every inch of them. but she couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in her chest. Why had fate brought this human to Srikta? Why now? The trees grew thicker, the sky darker, and the temperature began to drop as night fell. Elora knew the dangers of the dark on her world, the creatures that roamed the land, the things that crept and hunted beneath the cover of night. Her mind raced, every step measured, as she kept her pace steady. She didn't look back to see if Jake was keeping up, but she knew he was there. The thought of leaving him behind didn't cross her mind, not yet. After what felt like hours, they reached a small, sheltered cavern nestled beneath the roots of an ancient tree. Elora moved swiftly, gathering a few branches to start a fire in the center of the cave. Jake entered cautiously, looking around as though the walls might close in on him. His eyes darted from Elora to the fire she was building, the crackling sound of the flames filling the silence between them. "Is this safe?" he asked, still sounding unsure. "For now," Elora replied. "It's not a shelter meant for guests, but it'll keep you alive tonight. Tomorrow we leave." Jake nodded, sitting down cautiously by the fire. He still didn't seem entirely convinced by Elora's assurance, but for now, he seemed too exhausted to argue. He ran a hand through his hair, and Elora caught a glimpse of the vulnerability in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice softer than before. "I didn't think anyone would help me." Elora didn't reply immediately. Instead, she focused on keeping the fire strong, her mind still working through the countless questions swirling in her head. She had always believed that she was the only one, the only DeathWorlder, the only survivor in a universe filled with indifferent stars. But here was Jake, a human, a stranger, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, she felt something shift in the quiet space between them. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to bridge the gap between worlds. Maybe, together, they could survive Srikta. But that was something Elora wasn't sure about yet. There were too many uncertainties, too many dangers. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced around them, but for the first time in a long while, Elora allowed herself to hope, however faintly, that the universe had a purpose for their meeting. As the days passed, Elora and Jake began to form an unlikely partnership. At first, Elora had kept her distance, unsure of whether she could trust this human. He was from a world of ease, where survival was a matter of convenience rather than necessity, and the idea of relying on him felt strange. But over time, Jake's resourcefulness and determination began to impress her. He adapted faster than she had expected, learning how to hunt the smaller creatures of Srikta, finding shelter when the storms raged too fiercely, and even helping her gather the rare, dangerous fruits that grew in the heart of the forest. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, though there were still moments of tension. Elora had long since accepted that her existence on Srikta was solitary by design, and the idea of having someone at her side was both a blessing and a curse. She began to realize that she had underestimated Jake. He had not come here to conquer or plunder, as many others might have. He had come by accident, and now, like her, he was simply trying to survive. One evening, as they sat near their fire, Jake roasting some meat he had managed to catch, Elora cleaning her weapon, Jake broke the silence. "Elora, you said this planet was a death world. But I've been here for weeks now, and I don't know how to say this, but it's not all death. There's life here too. We're not alone. There's a strange beauty to this place." Elora raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. She had never thought of Srikta in those terms. To her, beauty was something distant, something that other worlds could claim, but not Srikta. "You're naive, human," she said, her voice colder than she meant it to be. "You don't know the dangers. You don't know what hides in the shadows, what crawls beneath the earth." Jake's expression softened, though, as he looked at her, his voice quiet but steady. "I know there's danger. I'm not blind. But I think you're afraid to see what's good here, too. We're still alive, aren't we? We've made it this far. Maybe it's because we're not just trying to survive, but also trying to understand." Elora looked away, her heart heavy with unspoken words. She had never been taught to understand Srikta beyond its brutality. To her, every moment spent alive was a small victory in a world that offered nothing but death. Yet, Jake's words lingered in her mind, settling like a seed in her chest. That night, as the two of them slept under the canopy of trees, Elora dreamed of something she hadn't thought about in a long time: home. Her real home before Srikta. A place that was green, warm, and safe. A place where the sun shone brightly in the sky, and the air didn't try to kill you. Elora had almost forgotten what it felt like to live in a place where you didn't have to watch every step, every breath, or every move. The next day, Elora awoke to find Jake already at the fire, preparing their meal. He looked up when she stirred, offering her a smile that made her stomach tighten. She knew he was still struggling, still trying to find a way back to his people, to his world. But in the meantime, he was here with her, an ally, a companion. After they ate, Jake came to her with a question that had been weighing on his mind for days. "I've been thinking," Jake said, his voice uncertain. "You've never told me much about your home, where you come from. Why is it called a DeathWorld?" Elora paused, looking away for a moment, the weight of her past pressing down on her. She had avoided sharing too much with him. There was so little to say, and yet everything about her origins felt too heavy to explain. But there was something in Jake's expression, an understanding, a patience, that encouraged her to open up. "I was born on a world where life is a constant struggle," she began, her voice low and quiet. "Srikta was meant to be a paradise once, but over time, it became a world where survival meant everything. Everything here is designed to kill you. The creatures, the storms, the landscape itself. There's no room for weakness, no place for those who can't adapt. My people, we learned to endure because we had no other choice." Jake listened intently, not interrupting, allowing her to speak. When she finished, he seemed deep in thought. "But Elora, you're not like the world you came from," he said gently. "You survived because you're strong, but you also survived because you've learned. You learned to adapt. You're not just a survivor. You're someone who can make the world better. Even this one." Elora's heart skipped a beat. His words weren't just kind, they were profound. She had never thought of herself in that way. All her life, she had been taught to fight, to survive at all costs. But Jake's words made her wonder if there was something more to survival than just getting by. "You think this world can change?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Jake met her gaze with unflinching certainty. "Yes, I think it can. And I think you can help me change it." The words felt like a spark, a tiny flicker of light in the oppressive darkness that had always surrounded her. Elora wasn't sure what it meant, but in that moment, she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. Not just because Jake had come into her life, but because they had begun to share something deeper than survival. They shared a belief in something greater, a belief that change was possible. Days turned into weeks. Elora and Jake continued their journey through the wilderness of Srikta, learning more about each other, surviving together. The more they shared, the more Elora realized that she had never truly understood what it meant to have a companion. She had always been told that isolation was her fate, that only strength could carry her through. But Jake had shown her something new, something worth fighting for beyond the brutality of her world. Eventually, Jake discovered a way to communicate with his people. Using the remnants of his broken ship, he managed to send a distress signal to the stars. Weeks passed, and just as Elora had grown used to the strange companionship they had forged, the day came when the sky was pierced by the unmistakable hum of a ship. When the rescue team finally arrived, Jake's people were overjoyed to find him alive. But to Elora's surprise, Jake didn't rush to board the ship. Instead, he turned to her, his gaze earnest. "You don't have to come," he said. "But you don't have to be alone anymore." Ellara's heart clenched. She had lived her whole life in solitude, had never imagined that anyone could care enough to stay. But there was something different about Jake. She had learned more about herself, about her world, than she had ever thought possible. "I don't know if I'm ready to leave Stricta," Ellara said quietly. "But maybe I don't have to. I'm not alone anymore, and that's enough." And with that, Ellara made a decision. She would leave Stricta behind, eventually. But for now, she would stay. She would learn to build a life, not just survive it. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly live. Together, Ellara and Jake stood, facing the horizon, their future uncertain.